But first, Sir David Steele presents the second of two programmes celebrating 20 years of Britain's longest-running satire show. 2 decades of weekending.
You see, that is the problem. Where does the satire begin and the corny old rubbish end? And that was my objection to the attack on me in Weekending. More than anything else, on artistic grounds, it wasn't really satire at all. It was pure and simple character assassination.
The voice of Derek Jemison, now familiar on Radio 2, but who in 1980 became the only person ever to sue Radio 4's Weekending for libel. Later in the programme, we'll be looking at the 4-year legal battle that resulted in a jury being asked to draw the line between satire and abuse. However, the idea of accountability was by no means a new one to Weekending. The programme began in 1970, an inauspicious time to start a weekly comedy about the news. In the 7 years since the end of That Was the Week That Was, politicians had rested easier in their beds, or on the benches of the House of Commons, in the secure knowledge that no one on radio or television was laughing at them.
Hello, and welcome to Going for a Song, in which Arthur Negus looks at some objects you've sent up and sends them up even further.
Well, Max, this is an interesting, if rather childish piece, and I would say that it's almost certainly Wedgwood.
Yeah?
In fact, it's a Wedgwood Ben.
Yeah.
Now, a Ben, of course, is a sort of whimsical mug used for dispensing such things as tripe, apple sauce, or the more outrageous sort of humbug.
Weekending was considered daring, not because it was hard-hitting or likely to bring down any government, but because it existed at all. One of Weekending's first producers, David Hatch, now managing director of Network Radio, felt himself under the gaze of the corporation's watchful but benevolent eye.
We were given tremendous encouragement by the controller. I mean, it was quite a brave thing to do. What we were doing on radio had never been done before. And I used to go home after producing the programme, and my phone would ring at about 12 o'clock, because we went out at 11:25, and the controller would go through it with me and say, I thought that was good, I thought that was good, I didn't think much of that, didn't like that order, why did you sing that song? And we used to have an editorial chat over the phone at midnight most Fridays, and then the following week we'd try and do better.
Morning, Stanley.
Good morning, Prime Minister. I mean, Harold. Ready to start when you are.
Very well. Useful tips for party political broadcasters. First, look at the camera like this. Lower the eyebrows, don't scowl, look as sincere as you can, and read the words on the auto cue. To be perfectly frank and honest.
To be perfectly frank and honest.
Rough diamonds, but we'll soon have you in shape.
Everybody at that time, because of the political nature of the programme, the entertainment department, it was rather new for them, so they kept a special watch on it. And you had various people coming in and out all the time to see what we were doing. I found this whole thing really quite daunting, and very nerve-wracking too.
That was Weekending's first writer, Pete Spence. With the burden of a weekly 25-minute script on his hands, he was somewhat relieved when, 6 weeks into the show's first run, Harold Wilson called an election. There was no question at that stage of the show continuing through the campaign. It wasn't until 1987 that Weekending was permitted to continue during an election due to fears that the balance of the programme could not be maintained at such a sensitive time. I asked Labour's Deputy Leader Roy Hattersley what he thought of the ban.
I think it's an absurd restriction to stop a programme like this running through a general election. It was the last, I think, of the absurd BBC ban, wasn't it? Starting with the 14-day rule 20 years ago, when people couldn't discuss things within a fortnight of them being discussed in Parliament, and ending with that. And I'm all for broadcasters of this sort being allowed to take it out on whom they choose.
As well as pressures from above, there has always been the threat of libel. In most cases, it has remained a threat. A spoken apology to Robert Maxwell, an exchange of letters about Reginald Bosanquet's wig. Perhaps Weekending became complacent that the law would never touch it, until, following a sketch broadcast on March 22nd, 1980, a writ arrived from one Derek Jemison.
In Derek Jameson, we have the archetypal East End boy made bad. Narrowly surviving a term of active service on the Mirror, he retired from newspaper work to become editor of the Daily Express. He arrived uncluttered with taste or talent and took to his new role like a duck to orange sauce, displaying an editorial
Jemison considered that the sketch was character assassination defamatory, offensive, unfair and untrue. The BBC claimed it was fair comment. The producer was Alan Nixon, and the writer of the offending sketch was John Langdon.
It was a complete surprise when the writ arrived on the producer's desk. I think the ink was still wet when it did land, and it was very soon afterwards. And we hadn't expected it because it was meant to be funny. It was meant to be very insulting and to describe him in a pretty poor light because we had a pretty poor opinion of him at the time and the sort of product that he represented.
At the time, there were comments both from me and people above me that perhaps it was a little long and therefore the viciousness of the attack seemed greater. And when the programme went out on that Friday, one or two people, David Hatch, who's then head of the department, felt it had been rather long, but because there was music behind it, we couldn't edit it down for the repeat.
We salute him as an editor with the common touch, who regards nudity as only skin deep and who still believes that erudite is a glue.
I wrote a line about thinking that nudity was skin deep, and he said that it's absolute rubbish. There has never been nudes in the Daily Express. And we hunted through them without much trouble. We found a picture of Leslie Crowther's daughter posing for a glamour shot wearing nothing but a hat. And he looked at this and said, well, she's not nude, she's got a top hat on.
All the nudes fit to print and all the news printed to fit. But it's as a craftsman. Remember,
journalists got so bored with the whole thing that they described the witnesses in terms of the carrier bags that they carried, and computed that Guy Jenkin, who was at the time working on Spitting Image and was a successful comedy writer and product Weekending, he carried a Tesco bag, whereas somebody who was only writing one-liners for Weekending was carrying a Harrods bag, and they had worked out the hierarchy of this, and the producer, who didn't have a carrier bag at all, was out completely.
So join with us now as we congratulate this man of a few syllables as he approaches his new labour of lust and starts the bull rolling in the paper that put the media in mediocrity. Derek Jameson, the nitty-gritty titivation...
Derek Jameson, the nitty-gritty titivation tout from Trafalgar House, is our man of the week. Well, people say, why did you take them to court? I certainly never wanted or intended that it should finish up in court. All we wanted at the outset was an apology, and 4 years later it finished up in the High Court. We got involved in the legal treadmill. My main objection was that word satire. I mean, everything was cloaked under the holy label of satire. Now, Sylvie Crin is satire. The Ministry of Silly Walks is satire. But this wasn't satire. It had no great literary or artistic merit. It was purely verbal butchery. It was character assassination. It was an insult to me, a working-class lad from the East End of London who left school at 14, grew up in total poverty without parents, and made it as editor of several newspapers. The idea, I mean, just look at some of those words. A man of few syllables. Am I a man of few syllables? Could anybody actually say that? You know, all I've written, all I've broadcast, all I've done. They class me as a loutish, illiterate oaf from the East End of London, and I regarded that as an insult, and I went for them.
After a 12-day case, during which Jameson spent 5 days in the witness box defending tabloid journalism, the jury decided that the sketch was defamatory. They also decided that it was fair comment, and he was ordered to pay the BBC's costs as well as his own, a total of approximately £75,000.
I won the case, you know. You talk about me losing. I won it. The jury said, yes, it's defamatory, but not malicious. That meant it wasn't inspired by any personal malice against me. The BBC apologised in court and said no personal reflection was intended. East End boy made bad, thinks erudite is a glue. I love the one from the wrist. He thinks from the wrist. Do you know there wasn't a single lawyer in that case who knew that thinks from the wrist implied, you know, that I was into masturbation? They'd never heard of it. They obviously hadn't been in the army.
The story so far. British intelligence get hold of certain papers indicating that sinister Argentinian General Galtieri has invaded the Falklands. These papers, the Evening Standard and the Daily Telegraph, finally reach the Foreign Office, where suave aristocrat Lord Carrington flicks through an atlas, and after discovering that the Falklands are British territory, has a fit of embarrassment from which he never recovers.
With the outbreak of the Falklands War, which was not to be called a war but a conflict, Weekending, along with the rest of the BBC, came under pressure not to criticise the government. Again, this pressure came not only from politicians, but from the upper echelons of BBC management, although calls for the show to be taken off the air were resisted. Nick Revell wrote some of his most powerful work during the Falklands War.
I did a piece having a go at the Sun's coverage of the war, which I was quite pleased with, and very pleased about the fact that I listened to the news on the Saturday morning after it should have gone out for the first time. And the lead stories in all the papers and on the news was the way that the Sun was being criticised in Parliament and everywhere else for being so disgusting with their coverage. Turned on the Saturday afternoon repeat thinking, great, let's hear the sketch that was ahead of the news. And it had been snipped from both shows.
Whoopee! It's War Week in your explosive Sun.
Competition time. See if you can think up new names for the grotty gauchos before the task force makes hash of the corned beef cowboys and win a Sun bulletproof t-shirt.
Have you got what it takes to be a super slick, slimy Dago Slayer? Find out in our Sun Knockout Quiz.
Play Jingo Bingo. This week's prize, £30,000 of high explosive to be dropped on an RG of your choice.
And on page 3, blonde bombshell Belinda can't wait to get among the RGs. But don't worry, fellas, she's no Junta's Judy. She's a Polaris missile, all primed up to create a few vibrations in Buenos Aires.
And the Sun says...
Well, I thought it was very, very good. It was all about the Sun's attitude. It was very, very, really weekending stuff, and it was funny. Well, we put it in the program. It went through the secretariat, went through the script editor, went through all these kind of things. And just before it went out, I got a phone call from the then head of department who said, just thought I'd call you up, old boy, to say that we had to take out that rather nasty Falklands piece that you had in there. I said, why? He said, well, I was listening through to the program at the end of the day, over a couple of drinks with head of stationery, and we were horrified. I mean, our boys are dying out there. So it was edited out.
That was the producer of the program, Jimmy Mulville. The man responsible for pulling the sketch was the then head of Light Entertainment Radio, Bobby J.
Jimmy obviously sees it from his point of view, being in charge as producer of a satirical program which satire must know no bounds whatsoever. But we had a lot of problems in the Argentine conflict. And I know that the piece which we pulled, which I pulled, was against the Sun. But the fact was that it was as a result of the sinking of Belgrano and the loss of 300 lives there. And I felt that this didn't seem quite right to be making fun of a situation like that.
Anything to report, number one?
Ship on the starboard bow, sir.
One of ours?
Yes, sir.
Thank God for that. Bloody hell!
One of ours, we sold them last year.
In the week of its 17th birthday, the BBC management decided that Weekending was mature and responsible enough to be permitted to stay on air during a general election campaign, as long as it was clearly balanced.
In order to maintain its well-deserved reputation for scrupulous fairness to all political parties in the run-up to the election, the BBC has appointed a monitoring team to ensure balanced presentation in the following programme. To assist in this, references to the Conservative Party will be followed by this, references to the Labour Party by this, and references to the Alliance by this.
Yes, we had the first election that we were allowed to stay on the air. And we had a different noise for each party. Every time they were about to speak, one for Conservative and one for Labour. And, of course, it was the SDP. Was it the Alliance? What was it called? Yes, the Alliance, that's right. Yes, it was disappeared now.
In the run-up to the general election, the SDP Liberal Alliance has launched its campaign ahead of the other parties. Liberal spokesman Mr. Alan Beef said that a Conservative estimate of voting trends among people in full employment promises a massive swing.
Every week I remember I had to go up and play the programme to a battery of men in suits who listened through and fortunately didn't make any changes. But we did have this ridiculous stipulation that if we were going to be doing an election campaign, we had to be balanced, and balanced meant almost exactly the same number of minutes and seconds per party, not counting the monster raving loonies of this world. So we actually made a virtue of this.
That was the producer during the election, Harry Thompson. Although he had to maintain a strict balance in terms of time, in comic terms, one party began to dominate.
Any second now, David, there'll be a gigantic surge of support for us. Alliance support is like a snowball. It starts off small...
and then melts.
Have faith, David. Remember, Alliance voters are thoughtful, though.
They've thought about it and decided not to vote for us. Ha ha ha! Oh! What was that?
A late swing, David.
Sorry I hurt your hand, David. Do you still love me, darling?
Also, the Alliance kept feeding us lines. The Alliance got this big yellow battle bus, which was so right for jokes. And they kept going on about the late swing. They said there was going to be a late swing to the Alliance. Well, I mean, there probably was, but what a suicidal thing to say. So there was a science fiction sketch about the Alliance touring the universe in their battle shuttle in the year 2001, looking for the late swing of 87.
The year 2007. I was working on the construction of a Type A three-dimensional vector space station, powered by compressed alpha trace elements. One day, our routine existence was interrupted as a small twin-engine craft idled slowly into view. We eyed the yellow aluminum vessel with suspicion. Could it be an Eastern Bloc killer satellite? Suddenly, its diatronic external address system clicked into life.
Hello, this is the Alliance Battle Shuttle. We are appealing directly to you, the floating voter, to help us achieve a massive late swing.
There were also a series of sketches where we had this ongoing apparent romance between David Steele, I mean, totally respectable, of course, David Steele and David Owen, all along the lines of brief encounter and lovers trying to say goodbye to each other. And as I recall, John Glover was David Steele and David Tate was David Owen.
Oh, David, you only wanted me for my constituency parties, didn't you?
David, don't, it's so sordid.
I suppose this is really goodbye, then.
David! I thought it was you, and with your nice doctor friend, too.
Oh, my God, it's that ghastly woman.
Actually, I think she's rather attractive.
Oh, David, how could you?
Isn't it amazing how you keep bumping into people? Do you know, I was only saying to Norman the other day, we must get together with those nice social democrats after the election.
Oh, I'm sorry, I must go. I feel a bit...
David!
I say, I wasn't interrupting anything, was I?
Oh, no, not at all. Why don't you sit down, Mrs. Thatcher?
Oh, thank you.
Good Lord, isn't that something in your eye?
Is it?
Wait a moment, I'll just get my hanky. Don't worry about him, he'll be all right.
Very wicked, but very perceptive too. The victim of one of the most grotesque caricatures of recent years has been Roy Hattersley. He's played on Weekending by David Tate.
It's a wicked impression of Roy Hattersley, really, because they always tend to over-exaggerate how Roy Hattersley had a slight speech impediment, and we do that and it gets even more. So it goes even spottier.
A sensational scheme, Neil, assured of instant success.
That's a good job he's overall so water.
I understand why they portray me in that particular way, though I must say I'm astonished by the incompetence with which Weekending produces my voice. It may be that I've got something the matter with my eardrums as well as with the palate of my mouth, but it always seems to me that my voice is so hideously distinctive that people who imitate me ought to do it rather better than they do. I have to be reminded it's me, but then I have to be reminded it's me when I turn out to be a bumbling ass at the end of the sketch.
Do you mind that sort of treatment?
I don't terribly. I think there are worse things to be than a bumbling ass. And I think anyone who is treated in that way is probably treated with a certain degree of affection.
I think politicians, actors, or whoever, I think secretly they're flattered if they are impersonated by programs. I think it means that people know who they are enough. Although sometimes the impersonation is so difficult, we have to announce the person coming in by name. Oh, good morning, Kenneth Clark. How are you? Oh, fine, thanks, Mr. Patton. Because otherwise nobody knows who's talking.
I think one has to know how to not step over the line, you know, and I think that I don't mind politicians being criticised, but not, I think, soldiers, especially when soldiers and sailors are fighting.
But do you enjoy programs like this?
Not very much, no. And I have got quite a sense of humour, but I think I prefer Shakespeare or something better.
And that was Tory MP Sir John Stokes. In common with most BBC programmes concerning politics, Weekending has been accused of both left-wing and right-wing bias. But the private allegiances of writers and producers should not affect the balance of the programme, and David Tate and producer Harry Thompson believe that they don't.
I think it debunks pomposity, perhaps, and self-importance, which is an important function in society. I don't think it is particularly left-wing. In the programme, the cast have differing political views. Bill and I have wonderful arguments where they turn up the PA system so that everyone can hear properly. We've had violent disagreements, but public figures, particularly in politics, I think fair game, really.
What's important is that the attacks are fair, and that if the government dominates the news, then by all means concentrate on the government, but in the knowledge that if the following week Labour put their foot in it in a big way, then the programme that week will attack Labour equally vociferously. That's the producer's responsibility.
When Weekending first began, it was the only source of political satire on radio or television. Now hardly a day goes by without a politician being put down, vilified, or impersonated in the name of comedy. So have the satirists cried wolf too often for anyone to listen to them anymore? And can political satire still have any effect? David Hatch.
As producers of it at the beginning, Simon and I were much more closely watched, and there was much more looking at what we did than I suspect there is now. Society accepts now that, public figures are there to be looked at and joked about, and pomposity is to be pricked. It was slightly new business when we started, which is why everybody listened to the programme very carefully in the corridors of Power and Broadcasting House. They don't now. I sometimes worry about that it is so appreciated. It ought probably to be annoying people rather more.
There's no evidence during the 80s which has seen more satire than any other period, really, apart from, the satire boom in the 60s. But I don't think even that, 100, 150, 200 political programs has half the effect of the poll tax. Do you know what I mean? It's just not even 100th the effect of the poll tax. It doesn't work like that.
Former producer Griff Rhys-Jones. The irony is that a truly hard-hitting Weekending in 1970, when it shied away from direct satire, would have had infinitely more impact than the programme can ever have now, when satire's edge has lost its sharpness through overuse. What might then have appeared dangerous, libelous, seditious and blasphemous appears commonplace now, when the cruelest caricatures of public figures go almost unnoticed. But had Weekending in 1970 attempted what is attempted every week in 1990, it would probably never have made it to a second series. And so to the next 20 years of Weekending, and a new generation of writers, producers, actors, and most importantly, politicians. Any future contributors to Weekending can at least rest assured that it has got better in the last 20 years, since its very first programme.
In fact, that's all from Weekending April the 4th, but just before I leave you, can I tell you, in case you missed it, the joke going the rounds this week? On Easter Sunday, a doctor called a plumber to deal with a blockage in his loo. The plumber said that as it was Easter weekend, he'd have to put up with it until after the holiday. But the doctor persisted and said that if he was ill, he would have to come out to him, holiday or no holiday. So the plumber gave way. He came to the house, looked in the loo, threw a couple of aspirins into the pan, and said, "If it's not better by tomorrow, call me again. Good night." Was it really as awful as that?
The voice of Michael Barrett, Weekending's original presenter, bringing to a close 2 decades of Weekending. It was presented by Sir David